Hi all, thanks for joining. My name is Jeremy Edwards. I'm a Governance and Oversight Manager here at Perpetual Corporate Trust, and I've been involved in a greenwashing project in response to the release of ASIC Infosheet 271. So I know a lot of you who are watching today have heard all about greenwashing, and I've spoken to a number of you in response to the greenwashing project. But today I wanted to give a bit of a recap of Infosheet 271, really set the scene, talk about the regulatory landscape, some of the ASIC greenwashing surveillance activities, give you a bit of an update on our enhanced testing project. But then also, I wanted to run through those 9 questions and those practical examples that you can apply when you are reviewing your PDS and any other marketing collateral. And then I thought it's good to highlight some of the bad disclosures that we have identified as part of the greenwashing project, and also through interactions with ASIC. But look, it's not all bad. I can also share with you an example of good disclosure. And then lastly, we will run through the disclosure document due diligence process update. So Info 271, how to avoid greenwashing for superannuation and managed funds. Well, why the need for Info 271? Why did ASIC release it? Well, prior to the release of Info 271, they commented that the level of disclosure relating to ESG considerations and PDSs within the industry was varied. There was a bit of a spectrum. Some contained a significant amount of detail, while others did not. And really what they were looking to facilitate is to really get rid of any misleading and deceptive conduct. And this was by ensuring there was truth in promotion and also clarity in communication. And by truth in promotion, they meant using labels that were defined and also defining the sustainability related terminology. So any jargon or undefined terms were really defined for investors looking at your product. And that clarity in communication was about providing explanations of how sustainability-related considerations are factored into investment strategies. So you couldn't simply state that you factor it in, or factor ESG in. You really need to dive into the how. But why focus on greenwashing? It's an interesting question. Well, managed funds and super funds, they are responding to the increasing investor demand for sustainability-focused financial products. So ASIC has highlighted that it is a number 1 priority for them, or one of the major priorities. And in our region alone, sustainability-labelled investments have more than doubled between 2019 and 2021. While globally, it's projected that ESG assets will exceed US $53 trillion by 2025, and that will represent more than a third of total assets under management. So ASIC went further to state that, labels or headline statements about a financial product's green credentials, they shouldn't be misleading. That is, being true to label, it's a regulatory must-have. So hence that's why they released this Infosheet 271 to give guidance to product issuers. They gave 9 important questions along with some practical examples that product issuers should use when considering their ESG disclosures in the PDS. But ASIC went further and with the expectation that issuers review their practices against Infosheet 271. So that is, whatever you're disclosing to the market, you have to be able to back it up with evidence and processes documentation. And look, ASIC certainly has been busy with their surveillance of greenwashing. And back in May of this year, they released a short report detailing the 35 interventions that it has made in response to its greenwashing surveillance activities. And their intervention, it resulted in 23 corrective disclosure outcomes and 11 infringement notices. And in one case, the commencement of a civil penalty proceedings. But one thing I want to note around about the corrective disclosure outcomes and the infringement notices is it wasn't just focused around managed funds. They did pick up a mining company and also an energy company on their greenwashing. So I suppose the key lesson there is if you do have any corporate sustainability programs, you want to make sure that your disclosures or your processes as disclosed are in line with ASIC Info Sheet 271. But in terms of managed funds, there were 14 responsible entities that had to update about 21 PDSs. And ASIC really focused on 4 key themes. That was namely those net zero statements and targets. And as we'll learn a bit further in the presentation, you can't simply state that you're going to reach net zero. ASIC really wants you to explain, well, how. What are you going to consider in those net zero targets? There's also the use of terms such as carbon neutral, clean, or green. The fund labels themselves. So if you're going to be having sustainability or impact or ethical in those labels, you want to make sure your disclosures are tight and your processes, and they are in line with ASIC Info Sheet 271. And then the last theme there was that scope and application of investment exclusions and screens. And this is what they picked up Mercer on and commenced that civil penalty proceedings. It was actually on the website that they picked it up. So Mercer on their website disclosed that they were excluding certain industries, involved in the fossil fuel industry, such as coal, but then also those involved in alcohol and tobacco, or gambling, sorry. However, when ASIC dived a bit deeper into the holdings of Mercer, they found that a number of the companies had exposure to these industries. And since the release of Rep 763, ASIC has actually commenced a second civil penalty proceedings, this time against Vanguard, also in relation to their claims around exclusions. And if you would like further information, we will be sharing this pack with this recording. And there are some links at the bottom of the slide where you can click through for further information. Now on the next page, slide here, I have provided a bit of a pretty picture that does show some of the observations in that Rep 763, some of the words that ASIC has picked up. So when you are reviewing your PDS disclosures or policy, any of the marketing collateral, you want to have a little think. Are any of these words included, and can they be defined better? Integration. Well, what do you mean by integration? Tobacco, is it simply the production and manufacture, or does it also extend to sale and distribution, as an example? So as always, part of our service is to monitor, the regulatory risks out there, the risks to yourself and to the funds. So as part of our response to ASIC Info Sheet 271, we commenced the greenwashing enhanced testing project around August last year. And at a high level, our GM of Transaction Management and Governance, Phil Blackmore, he reviewed those our 80 plus investment managers on our book. He reviewed their disclosures, and he identified 37 investment managers who had ESG disclosures. And just like ASIC, it was with varying detail. So we kicked off a project, and the aim of the project was twofold. Well, number one was to review all the ESG-related disclosures, including the PDS, ESG frameworks, policies, website disclosures, ESG reporting, to ensure the adherence to the guidance of ASIC Info 271. Now, the second aim of the project was to validate or verify the ESG disclosures. And this was by reviewing those internal investment-related documents, investment theses, any other internal processes, holdings reports, verifying how you are screening for any exclusions, proxy voting and engagement records. And look, the outcome of this project was that there were 120 recommendations and actions, and this ranged from uplifting the PDSs, ESG frameworks, policies, website disclosures, and also in a couple of instances, the internal investment process. And look, without naming any names, one manager was disclosing that they were mapping each of the company's research to one of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. However, when I looked at the investment documentation, I couldn't evidence this. So they have now uplifted it to evidence that they mapped to the UN SDG, but not just that they've mapped it, also, well, why? How does it apply? And it also resulted in 21 managers requiring uplifts of their PDSs and their IM disclosures. But look, with the project, it doesn't just stop here. Whenever you are rolling PDSs or launching new products, rolling PDSs out of cycle or launching new products, you'd also do well to consider these 9 questions of ASIC Info Sheet 271. So look, we will dive into those 9 questions now with some practical examples before we dive into some of those examples of good disclosure, bad disclosure, and the process updates. So here are the first 5 questions. So the first one there is your product true to label? If you're going to include, as I mentioned before, if you're going to include sustainability or impact within your product label, you want to make sure it's true to label. You want to make sure all your disclosures and processes are tight and they are in line with ASIC Info Sheet 271. Secondly, have you used vague terminology? That pretty leaf that I showed you, revenue, are you defining that, tobacco, etc.? And thirdly, are your headline claims potentially misleading? And then 4 and 5, this is really diving into your processes. So have you explained how sustainability-related factors are incorporated into your investment decisions? And it also includes your stewardship activities. And then 5, well, if you are, as part of your incorporation of ESG, if you're using investment screens, are you adequately disclosing if they're subject to any exceptions or qualifications? And then the last 4 questions here. Number 6 is an interesting one, which we will get into a bit further, but this is really if you have any influence over the benchmark index. And if so, you should really be disclosing the level of influence. Number 7, have you explained how you use metrics related to sustainability? So for example, if you are assigning an ESG score and using metrics, have you adequately disclosed enough information about the metrics for investors to understand? Number 8, question number 8 is honing in on those targets. Have you explained how the target will be measured and achieved? As I mentioned before, you can't simply state that you're going to reach net zero by 2050 without explaining how or how it's going to be measured and achieved. And then lastly, this really encompasses it all, that if you are providing additional information about your ESG process, is it easy for investors to locate and access relevant information? But before we move on to each individual question and some of those examples, I wanted to highlight that these questions, they can't be looked at in isolation. ASIC stated that when they are looking at whether something is misleading, they take into consideration all the facts and they look at the overall impression created for an investor. So if you have a little disclosure in your PDS about the process, but then a lot of disclosure on your website, well, what's the overall impression? Is that confusing to an investor? So here we go. First question with the example. So is your product true to label? Now this is quite a simplistic example, and I should highlight that a lot of these examples are quite simple that ASIC provided, but we found through the project that it is slightly more nuanced. But anyway, with this one, a sustainability related product is labeled no gambling fund. However, when you look at its terms, the product may invest in companies that earn less than 30% of their total revenue from gambling activities. Now, is that really a no gambling fund? It doesn't sound like it. But then equally, as I mentioned, if you are going to be putting sustainability or impact or ethical, ASIC is going to hone in on these, which we have seen. So you do want to make sure that your disclosures are tight and in line with ASIC Info Sheet 271. So question 2, have you used vague terminology? Well, the example here is that an issuer, they claimed on their website and the various social media platforms that it's committed to making investments that contribute towards positive impacts for its investors and the world. However, they don't disclose what it considers to be positive impacts and how they contribute to these stated outcomes. So you can't just simply state that you're going to contribute towards something without explaining how. And then equally, positive impacts is quite vague. it can mean different things to different investors. Question number 3. Are your headline claims potentially misleading? Now, this particular example here, an issuer makes a promotional statement that we do not invest in tobacco products. So immediately, that's pretty absolute. You would think that it wouldn't. However, under its terms, the issuer's exclusionary investment screen for tobacco products, it permits investment in companies involved in the manufacture, sale, and distribution of tobacco products, where the company's revenue earned from those activities is below a particular threshold level. Now, what ASIC is concerned about here is that the promotional statements are likely to be misleading and unable to be rectified by disclosure. Because as I mentioned, the headline claim is a statement in absolute terms, and it's potentially inconsistent with the use of revenue thresholds. So really consider those words that you are using when referencing exclusions, all those in those headline claims. And one thing that ASIC said, that the more that you need to disclose, so the more that the statement needs disclosure around exceptions or qualifications, the more prominently those qualifications or exceptions need to be disclosed. So you have to really, really think about those headline claims that you're using, and you can back them up. So question number 4, have you explained how sustainability-related factors are incorporated into investment decisions and stewardship activities? And look, the example here, an issuer is just stating that it considers, integrates, or takes into account sustainability-related factors, and they haven't really explained how. I mean, is that really beneficial for an investor, just stating that we incorporate it? Not really. So ASIC really wants issuers to explain clearly what these terms mean and use specific and clear language. And question number 5 really builds on this one. So as part of your incorporating ESG into your investment decisions, if you do use those investment screens, are any of the screening criteria subject to any exceptions or qualifications? Have you disclosed that? So the example here is around revenue. So this sustainability-related product, it applies a revenue-based exclusionary screen that excludes investments in companies earning more than 10% of their revenue from providing palm oil as an input ingredient. So look, ASIC would generally expect the issuer to disclose, well, what does revenue mean? For example, is it gross? Is it net? And where can you find it? Is it in their audited financial reports? Do you receive it from MSCI, RepRisk? So you really need to be clear where you're getting this information and really highlighting those exceptions or qualifications in detail. So number 6, do you have any influence over the benchmark index for your sustainability-related product? And if you do, is your level of influence accurately described? And I know a number of the investment managers that we have in our book, they're either benchmark agnostic, or they track some of the bigger, more common benchmarks, MSCI, All World, ASX 200 as an example. So, you wouldn't really expect to have any influence over these. However, if you are launching a product where you may have any influence over the benchmark, you do want to ensure that you are disclosing it. And by influence, this could mean that you sit on some boards or advisory committees around what can go in the index, or how the index is structured. So really the example here is they're talking about a sustainability-related product who adopts a passive investment strategy by tracking a combination of sustainability-related indexes administered by third-party index providers. However, the PDS, it doesn't disclose that the product issuer actually has an active input on the adjustments or the negative or exclusionary screens applied to the underlying indexes. So if they can dictate what can or cannot be in that index, is it really a passive strategy? So they might not be actively trading, but they're actively changing the benchmark. So that really needs to be disclosed. Question number 7, have you explained how you use metrics related to sustainability. So I know a number of managers or do rely on sustainability related metrics when they are assigning an ESG score when evaluating investments. And what ASIC is asking here is that if you do disclose that you use metrics, then you need to disclose the extent to which the metrics are used, the sources of the sustainability related metrics. Are these based on your own methodologies? Are they from MSCI, RepRisk, Sustainalytics? But then also a description of that underlying data. Is it greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3? And then I suppose this is where that last one comes in. Any risks or limitations arising from your reliance on metrics. For example, scope 1 and scope 2. There's no legislation dictating that you have to disclose these. So there might be some companies who aren't reporting on their sustainability. On their climate or greenhouse gas emissions. So you have to obviously disclose those limitations and how you're working around it. Question number 8 is around targets. Do you have reasonable grounds for a stated sustainability target? And have you explained how this target will be measured and achieved? So in this instance, as we've talked about previously, the issuer promptly states that it's committed to reaching net zero carbon emissions across all of its investment portfolios. However, it doesn't really give any information as to how it expects to achieve it, any interim targets, how it's going to measure it, and then once again, any risks or assumptions. For example, I mentioned previously that there's no legislation stating that companies have to disclose their climate-related data. So if you're setting a target for net zero by 2050, one of the assumptions might be that by 2040, it will be mandated for climate reporting for all companies that you invest in. So it's adequately disclosing those assumptions that will allow you to get to that net zero objective. And then lastly, number 9, is it easy for investors to locate and access relevant information? Is it consistent across all channels? If you are providing a link in your PDS, is it easy for investors to, does the link work? And once they've clicked through, is it easy for them to navigate and find the additional information? It should be consistent across all mediums. So whatever's disclosed in the PDS, it must be consistent across your website, reports, any social media posts, as it says here, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. And then lastly, you should be conscious that providing significant volumes of sustainability-related information, it's not really appropriate. You don't want to be seen to be confusing investors. So we have had some interactions with ASIC, which has been quite beneficial just to sort of validate a lot of the project work we have done. And a couple of the PDSs that they reviewed, they had these 4 concerns. One was vague terminology and the use of undefined terms. And you see the third dot point there, ESG factors, ESG risks. You can't simply state that you incorporate ESG factors. You really have to give the investor an idea of, what are these ESG factors? There's many out there. They can mean many different things. Even the use of words such as sustainability headwinds and tailwinds, sustainable development, they can have different meanings to different people. So they really need to be defined. The next one there, incorporated information. So if what happened here is the investment manager was referring to the reference guide as it had important information on their ESG approach. However, there wasn't a link to the RG, and it wasn't easy to locate this RG on their website. So really, if you are going to reference a additional document website, you need to make sure the link works. And secondly, you need to make sure that the link takes you directly to that information or document that you are referencing. The one in the bottom left-hand corner there, true to label issue. So the funds that ASIC picked up, so it had sustainability and leaders in the name. So really, as I mentioned previously, if you are going to use those sort of terms, sustainability, ethical, leaders, impact, you really want to make sure your disclosures are tight and in line with ASIC Info Sheet 271. Now, the last one here in the right-hand corner, this is a bit of a curious case. So this particular disclosure document didn't have a link to the website. However, when assessing what was in the website, when assessing what was in the PDS, ASIC went to the website and took a look at the information presented there. And their concerns were that important information found on the website, they may not be adequately summarized in the PDS. And then equally, an investor who does not read the website information may miss this important information. And then lastly, even if the investor reads the website information, it is unclear whether that website information applies to the fund. There's uncertainty as to whether it does or does not apply. So the learning here is that any information that is on the website relating to the fund, you want to make sure that it is adequately summarized in the PDS, or if you have different approaches for different funds, you want to make sure it's clear on the website what the approach applies to, or what fund the information applies to. So as part of the greenwashing project, I did want to highlight a couple of examples we found of bad disclosure. An example A here, I won't name any names, the manager disclosed that they will endeavour to avoid investments in tobacco and controversial weapon companies. So I suppose the relevant questions from Info Sheet 271, it really does centre around the investment screening. Have you explained your investment screening criteria? Any of the screening criteria subject to any exceptions or qualifications? And I suppose I could also put number 2 here. Have you used vague terminology? You're probably sitting there thinking, yes, the word endeavour, that is pretty vague. The investment manager, they haven't been clear if this is a negative screen or not, particularly with the use of that word endeavour. Are there exceptions or qualifications to these endeavours? And then equally, they would need to define tobacco and controversial weapons. So example B, it also is along the same vein with those investment screening criteria. And the statement here is that it may take into consideration a company's corporate governance, workplace health and safety, labour and environmental practice, or whether its industry sector may have a negative impact on society, such as tobacco and gambling. So yep, you've probably guessed, it's that word may. It's fairly vague. There needs to be clear disclosure of the circumstances in which the investment manager may or may not consider these industry sectors. In reality, we'd like to see that word may sort of disappear. And then equally, these circumstances need to be clearly documented in an internal process, which is a must. But look, it's not all bad. I did also want to highlight a best-in-class good disclosure, and this is in relation to the JP Morgan Climate Change Solutions Active ETF. So last year when this was being launched, it's a listed ETF, ASIC reviewed the PDS, so we got some valuable insight into what they were looking at. So I'll scroll through so you can see that they do have all their exclusions listed there. And I want to highlight now why we regard this as good disclosure. So, the relevant questions, have you explained how sustainability-related factors are incorporated into investment decisions and stewardship activities? And look, JP Morgan, as you can see there, they've defined environmental issues, social issues, and the governance issues. So they've got the what they're incorporating, but also highlighted there, they've described or disclosed how they're going to incorporate it. Now, the manager does use an exclusionary screen, And as you can see on the next tab, they have got that example of that they have expanded a lot on those exclusions. Anywhere it's a bit vague, for example, revenue, I put a footer there. They've defined what revenue is, norms based, when they will or will not address it based on norms screening there. Also, they've defined controversial weapons, and they've got clear revenue percentages. So they really have done a good job there in ensuring that there's enough information for investors to understand the process and what will be excluded from the fund. So look, it is an evolving space, and we certainly have learnt a lot over the last 12 months, but we certainly do need to keep evolving. And I wanted to update the disclosure document due diligence process, which is relevant to you. So you should have received by now a pack from your client manager, which does include the quick focus guide, also the example ESG disclosures, and a bit of an update on the PDS verification. But essentially, the quick focus guide, it is to highlight key focus areas of a PDS and provide some guidance on the considerations and assessment that should occur. And it does have an ESG section included outlining expectations on this disclosure, and it also attaches the example ESG disclosures in that second box there. So there really are three examples. One is a fund manager strategy that is designed as an ESG fund and they have a clear ESG process. Number two is a fund manager who incorporates ESG as part of the overall process, but it's not an ESG fund. And then the last one there is a fund that just does not consider ESG. We did find that probably 80%, 90% of our managers do fit into bucket two. But I do want to give the warning, as will be in bold in red on that example ESG disclosures, is that these aren't to be copied and pasted. Okay, they are guides. Obviously, your process is unique to you. So these will just be used as a guide only. And then lastly, there is that PDS verification. So we can use some of the evidence from the DD and also from the greenwashing project. However, we obviously have to consider the time in between. So as part of the PDS, amongst other things, we will request some verification of your ESG process, so policy, whether it's any screenshots of how you monitor your exclusions there. That's certainly more information would have been included in that email from your client manager. So that's the end of the presentation there. I hope you have found it useful. I want to thank you for your time. And if you do have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to myself and my team. Yeah, thank you.